Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of CNC Basecamp. Got something good today, got some help. With me is Dillon Baker. He is an editor, a builder, and a designer with the conglomeration of Woodsmith, ShopNotes, and Popular Woodworking. And he's been working on some really cool projects and he's here to share a few of them with us. So Dillon, what do you got today?
So I've been working on a special interest book for here at the magazine, kind of an extension of what we already do. However, I have this interest in seating forms, and so I came up with this idea of creating an all plywood seating SIB, just as a way to explore chair forms, but also explore the material itself.
Now, you mentioned plywood, and that makes my ears tick up because one of the great things a CNC machine can do is cut out sheet goods. So how do you see the CNC working into all this?
So I admittedly have never used a CNC machine before, and I thought that this would be a good way to kind of segue into learning a new tool in the shop, but again, also be able to experiment with a material that is commonly used on a CNC machine. I kind of look at it as another, again, kind of arm or tool in the shop that can be used while you're working on other parts for that project or perhaps another project.
Yeah, I think one of the fun things is the different ways the CNC can be incorporated into a workshop. A lot of times here it's simply another tool, table saw, bandsaw, CNC machine, and we will use it for various projects for the magazines. But sometimes it's fun for me to just think about this as the primary tool, and then I add a few portable power tools, the usual hand tools, and that's a pretty powerful combination too. But either way, it really can add a lot to your abilities in your shop. So you've got a couple projects picked out for us.
Yes.
Why don't you go ahead and go through and kind of give us the tour of each one.
Sure.
Any special attributes, what your thoughts are in terms of the design, the finishing, and just a good overview before we get started cutting out plywood.
All right, perfect. So kind of the genesis of the plywood seating special interest book was a project I did for Popular Woodworking. While I was back in school, which seems like ages ago now, I came across a furniture designer named Ken Landauer. And he's actually been making chairs for about 30 years, or at least been doing woodworking for 30 plus years. But his whole concept is to use 99% of an entire sheet or 4x8 sheet of plywood. So minimal waste and creating chair forms or seating forms that not only maximize the space, but are ergonomically correct. And so I like the idea of designing around sort of these restrictions, but I also think it's just kind of a clever way to design, to maximize space and material, and to really think about those two things that go into the success of a chair or a comfortable chair. So this first one, like I said, was a Popular Woodworking project. I kind of adhered more to that, or close to zero waste philosophy. One of these chairs can be cut from an entire piece of 4x8. My waste is probably closer to maybe 10%, so I'm probably not as close as I'd like to, but again, this was just kind of a jumping off point for the inspiration for the rest of these projects. But basically, you've got your two side panels on here, following a very kind of shallow curve, which would be or function as the armrest. You have an angled front piece here. You have a very shallow arc on the bottom to, again, just to give it a little bit of visual lightness. You just have a couple different spots where it's touching the ground. Again, I wanted the side to look dynamic without, again, having too many pieces cut away and then having pieces I couldn't incorporate back into. So again, the idea also is to, if I'm removing any material, how can that be integrated back into the piece? Is it going to function as a back? Is it going to be a stretcher? Both of the sides on this chair, they just mirror one another. So all of the information you're seeing on this outside here, you will also see on the other side. And when they're flipped on the sheet of plywood, they I don't want to say they mate, but they're close enough again to reduce the cut path and the amount of material that's wasted. And then you'll also see the inner components here. I have a stretcher out front, and then there's also another stretcher that runs along the back to provide necessary support for the seat. The seat itself rests in a 1/4-inch dado on either side, again, just for further support. It also helps register the angle of the seat into the 2 side panels. And then you'll notice on the sides, which is true for the back piece, is that you have these 3 little tab cutouts. They're just functioning as through tenons for the stretchers. And then the bottom as well as the back stretcher are screwed in through the bottom into the seat pan as well as the back. You'll also notice on the back side here, I provided a couple of holes for some conformat screws. And so if you wanted to just use this as, or just use plywood as your backing for the seat pan and the back, you can. However, these holes were created to fasten an upholstered piece. So if you wanted to add upholstery to this, which I did in the magazine, again, just to give it a little bit more cushion and comfort, you can. The other thing I really like about plywood is there's just a lot of different ways that you can kind of doctor up the plywood depending on what you're getting. So, you know, the stuff can be painted. If you have veneered plywood, of course, you could finish it, paint edges, leave edges exposed. Baltic birch has evenly spaced evenly thick pieces of veneer that are face laminated together, so it gives a really nice visual effect. And then another kind of feature of this chair too is a circular cutout, which is kind of a motif I've carried through a lot of my pieces. Again, I just wanted to create some visual lightness. Again, having these larger panels, things can start to seem a little bulky or chunky, and being able to kind of see through and then having a glimpse of the seat pan and perhaps even the upholstery, I thought was just kind of a nice aesthetic detail. Functionally, it doesn't have a whole lot to do, but again, I'm just trying to create visual as well as some physical lightness with this chair. Now, the nice thing about this chair as well, I was able to expand this out, and so if you're wanting to do a grouping, if you want to just make 2 of these, you can. I wanted to do 1 chair and then 1 love seat, and the only thing that changes with the love seat are the length of the stretchers and then the length of the back as well as the seat pan. Oh, here we go. We have a nice glimpse of what the love seat looks like, which is basically just a double wide version of the chair. All the same construction methods, again, just a little bit longer pieces, same profile pieces, and does still have the option to be upholstered.
Well, we're ready to start cutting some parts for the lounge chair. So Dillon, what did we decide here as far as what we were going to use the CNC machine for versus what we're going to use the big production shop for?
Sure, so we wanted to use the full range of the CNC, so we decided to cut out the 2 sides of the lounge chair using the CNC machine. There's several different types of cuts it's going to be performing. If we weren't using the CNC machine, it would require us to set up a bunch of different jigs, a bunch of different stops. There's ultimately a bunch of different procedures that you would have to set yourself up for. So I just thought that using the CNC machine would save us a little bit of time. It might also allow for a little bit better accuracy, but it'll also allow us to continue to cut stuff in the shop. So we're kind of utilizing our time or splitting our time between working in the shop, but also allowing the CNC to do a little bit of work for us.
Yeah, it's always kind of a balancing act, isn't it? I know we were just discussing there are counterbore holes for upholstery panels. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's one of those things for doing just 1 chair, maybe we're better off just to go ahead and table saw the overall rectangles out and then use the drill press.
Sure.
But if we had an order for a restaurant where we had 50 of these things, hey, we're going to use the CNC to drill all those holes.
Now, the first project I did outside of the chair were a set of these stools. There's 2 heights of these. This one's a little bit taller. I think it's closer to maybe 25 inches tall, 28, and then I have one that's more of like seat or couch height, which is 18 inches tall. So the only thing that really differs on these are the length of the legs. What I like about this is that there are a lot of, again, light components, and so all three of these legs you see here are the exact same shape. There is a cutout on one face of each leg. There is a miter on the length of the bottom down here. It's a little hard to see. I'll try and rotate it a little bit here. You can see down in the center that they mate here just at a 30-degree angle on either side. And then as you follow up to the top, there is a tenon that goes through the top or the seat form, which is two pieces of 3/4 inch Baltic birch. Again, this was more of kind of a visual decision. I wanted to kind of beef up the top to give nice contrast to just the 3/4 inch thickness of the legs, but also provide enough or more material for the tenons to run through, which again is another kind of characteristic of some of these pieces you'll see are the through tenons. So the Baltic birch tenon goes all the way up through the top, kind of utilizing the radius that's left or created by the router bit. Whether you do this on the CNC or if you were to do this handheld, again, the router bits leave a radius. There's no, perfect 90. And instead of having to go back and chop those out, I just left them because it's much easier to round over or radius your tenons, and it makes for a really, really nice fit. And again, just kind of thinking about ways to eliminate more work, part of the design concept behind these stools. Another little feature I added on this stool too, is you'll see on the top, there's circle piece. This was something that would happen probably after the fact if you weren't using a CNC machine. I would glue the legs up into the seat pan. The seat pan functions kind of as a clamp too. It helps register the legs, but it also helps tie those miters down together at the bottom. But oftentimes you'll see in traditional joinery, you will see a single wedge or double wedge tenon that is to help spread out the tenon and seat it in the mortise. I ended up using a 1-inch dowel, which is slightly larger than the thickness of the plywood. Again, this is functional, but also aesthetic. And so having all this plywood, you've got edge grain coming through the face grain of the Baltic birch, and then you have a nice hardwood dowel that will go down in there that will help spread out the tenon. But again, you have the nice visual aspect of the end grain of the dowel. So again, playing around a lot around with shape, texture of wood, graining, and then again, just thinking about what types of plywood you want to use. A lot of these are really open-ended, and I think they allow for a lot of room to be manipulated and kind of customized to the way that you like them, whether that's based off environment or just personal taste. This is the shorter one here. Again, it is just, again, a smaller version of the larger one.
Okay, we're moving on to the stool now. So we're going to cut first off the top and then the legs. So we're cutting the whole thing on the CNC this time, aren't we?
We are, yeah. There's a couple different cuts that we're going to be doing on the top, and then once we get to the legs, we can talk to why we're going to be cutting out the base for the stool as well.
Now, I did switch bits from the last time we showed the machine running. When we were doing the sides for the lounge chair, I used a straight bit, and that's because we had a series of different cuts. We had some pocket cuts, through cuts, and it just made sense to use the straight bit to get the best finish overall. Now for this piece, I'm actually going to use a long upcut spiral bit, and we don't usually use spiral bits for the best finish in Baltic birch plywood, but here's why. When it cuts the perimeter of this, there is going to be a bevel applied to it, so any little tear outs can be cleaned up through that. But the main reason I'm going to use this long bit is because I really want to get those chips out of the pockets, out of that kerf. And so I really felt like I needed to use the spiral bit to have that action, to keep that kerf clean. So I think it's going to do a pretty good job. So let's go ahead and fire up the machine, and we're going to cut the top of the stool. There'll be 3 pockets, which are mortises for the legs, and then a perimeter cut.
The third one I did recently that I would like to explore a little further. All of the components we need are modeled to do on the CNC machine. Again, I'm kind of looking at the CNC at this point as being just kind of an extension of my pre-existing shop. It's a tool, it's a resource to cut out certain parts. However, it may be quicker or make more sense to cut out some of these rectangular pieces just over at a table saw, or if you have a track saw. Again, there's really no reason, not that you couldn't, but there's really no reason to cut these out on the CNC machine. Again, unless you're someone that wants to do everything with that particular tool or device. This one I'm calling the reading stool. It's about the same height as the second version of the last stool I showed you. Again, you'll notice the circular cutout here motif, again, acting more as an aesthetic than a functional aspect of it. However, I do like the fact that oftentimes it's exposing what's underneath or behind it. Down below here, you have two panels, which I would cut out at the table saw. These are to house books. You've got a nice 90-degree angle. They rest in there. My thought, which isn't included now, is I'd like to include some other materials. So I thought about perhaps putting a piece of bungee cord through the front here for some of your larger books, just so, again, they don't spill out. If you don't have this thing completely chocked full of them, again, there's going to be a little movement in there, and so I wanted another way to contain them. Those are just doweled in. So I've just got a dowel on either end. If I go ahead and eliminate that, you'll notice that there's the dowel holes on that panel, this would be the main part we're cutting out here. So 4 dowels to hold in the bottom stretchers that house the books. Up top here, again, I've got the two kind of oversized dowels here, and that's functioning as our joinery and kind of registration point for the top. Again, it just adds some nice visual contrast. However, it is fully functional. And then looking back at the profile here too, I have both of these boards at a slight angle. I think they're maybe somewhere around 5 degrees. This is just kind of something I'm experimenting with, and as part of the challenge with any seating form is that, everybody has a different body type. Everyone has their own kind of definition of what's comfortable, and so this kind of allows me a baseline of, again, to kind of just use this as a litmus test and figure out, what's going to be comfortable for the widest range of people. There's a little bit of a cutout here. Again, that's more visual. It might become functional over time, but again, these are all things that I can really adjust and experiment as I go without having to really sacrifice a lot. I mean, these forms are very simple, and so it doesn't really take a lot to manipulate them on the computer or make the tweak on, perhaps the CNC or another tool. You can see the dowels running through there that connect down into the sides. I also chose on this one to double up or laminate my 3/4 inch Baltic birch. Again, that was just kind of a visual thing. Before adding the stretchers, I wasn't sure I even wanted them, so I wanted to make sure I had legs that were stout enough to support the top and then not to splay under pressure. Again, it just kind of experimenting with what may work and what might not work. But again, it's one of those things you don't really know until you experiment. So those are the projects I currently have. Again, continuing to expand on those. Typically with our special interest books, we need anywhere from probably 10 to 13 projects, and so this will be an ongoing thing for me to, again, explore chair forms, but again, acquire some proficiency in using the CNC machine with Chris's help, of course. So now we're moving into our last project, which is the rocking reading stool. And we've kind of demonstrated a couple different cutting techniques on the first two projects. We've gone through using a straight cut bit, but we've also used an upcut spiral bit to make certain types of cuts that are giving us a preferred finish. Now, since we have a hybrid of cutting patterns on this last piece, there's one last bit that we want to talk about, which is called the compression bit. So Chris, do you want to talk to why a compression bit is a good choice for this type of project?
Sure. Well, different bits have different cutting qualities, of course. Now, what I have in my hand here is a down cutting bit, down cutting spiral, and that will give a fantastic finish on the top of the workpiece because it's going to push those fibers down. This spiral bit definitely clears the chips out, but it's going to tear the fibers on the top of the workpiece, but it'll leave a good finish on the bottom. So what we want is both bits, right? And we get both bits by using a compression bit. So the compression bit is going to be down cut at the tip and then up cut for the balance of the bit. And so it's both qualities, and it's going to give us a fantastic finish on the top and the bottom. That's what I've got in the machine right now, and so I think we're all ready to cut one of the sides for this really great rocking book stool of Dillon's.
Now, after talking about the variety of bits and their different functions here at the CNC, we finished up all the cutting we'd like to do with the machine. As you can see here, we have a completed side. The tabs are still intact. I will use some hand tools to knock those out and get them cleaned up. And the rest of the work we're actually going to perform in at the shop.
Well, Dillon, we got a lot of parts here. Why don't you walk us through the assembly and construction of each of these pieces?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So last time we went through the process of cutting all of our parts out, or most of them. We did go ahead and opt to cut some of them out in the shop, just because we thought it'd be a little bit easier just cutting some rectangular pieces. There's a minimum amount of machining that had to happen, and again, we're just trying to streamline the process as much as possible. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is, as promised last time, we're going to talk about the assembly of a couple of these stools, and then I do have a couple finished ones we'll talk about at the end and go over a little bit of the finishing processes. So the first one I have up here is one of the shorter stools. If you can remember, we did 2 heights of these. We went ahead and CNC'd the whole top out and then did all of the mortising on the CNC as well. We went ahead and cut out the legs. Obviously a learning curve here. So I opted to go ahead and do my radius edges on my tenons over just on a router table. We did go ahead and cut these fillets on the CNC machine, hoping that we'd have enough clearance for the shoulders to meet flush with the bottom of the stool. However, I did find that the fillets did not go quite in far enough. Again, all part of the learning process, so I did have to pare those down a little bit to give a sharp edge on the shoulder there, just so I'd have a nice flush connection with the bottom. Outside of that, everything else went pretty smooth. Another thing I had planned out in my head was how to go about creating the pegs that go on the top that are acting as basically a wedge to splay out the tenon. So on my first round, I had went ahead and CNC'd the radius or the outside profile of the peg. And then I went ahead and inserted these without glue, so I did a dry glue up. And then I brought this over to the drill press and then drilled down into the tenon, and then I went ahead and glued everything up and then added the pegs. Well, what I found out by doing that is not having the legs secure in place, that I got a little bit of chatter, things came out of alignment a little bit, and then when I went ahead to glue everything up, the legs were specific to the individual mortises, and the pegs lined up, but they were offset a little bit. So again, all part of the learning process. The CNC isn't perfect. You're still going to have to implement a lot of the kind of problem-solving aspects you have with just traditional woodworking. So I think best suited for this was to go ahead and glue everything up and then drill for the pegs and then add them after the fact. So the process of clamping this guy up, just go ahead and turn it up on its face. You can go ahead and insert your 3 legs. The mortises are kind of acting as a clamp or an alignment to help all of these miters on the bottom register in place. They are going to be a little loose, so I'd go ahead and grab the bottom, flip it over. And I found the best clamp that works for this is going to be a ratchet strap. The nice thing about this is it applies the appropriate amount of pressure, but it still allows you to use a mallet to kind of knock things in place. And so if everything isn't completely registered, you can give a nice soft tap on any one of the 3 sides, again, to just kind of get your alignment. I was able to do this fairly quickly, so I just went ahead and used some traditional Titebond 1 glue. If you feel as if you want to have more open time, epoxy is always a great option for open time. So if you find yourself having to unclamp and reclamp and switch things up, you can. So you've got the ratchet on the outside, just kind of adjusting to make sure that my miters are all aligned there at the bottom in the center here. Of course, having gravity in my favor, I can kind of push down on the top. And what I would have done is applied glue to those miters, of course, before I did this, and then applied glue to my tenons, and then clamped everything up. I don't really think that it requires having the top clamped down to a bench. Again, I think there's enough surface area here between the tenon and then the shoulders of my legs that will hold everything together fine. The reason I didn't glue this is because I'm still kind of considering what sort of finishing technique I want to do. We'll talk about that a little bit more with the chair that we showed last time. I like to finish some parts first before I glue them up, just depending on the option. So again, back to the process of this. Say this is all glued up. The next thing I'd want to do is I would go over to a drill press or use a drill guide, and I would find my center point on these tenons, and I would go ahead and drill out those pegs, add glue, and then I would drive those in. And of course, any finishing would proceed or before, depending on what you'd like to do. So that's the process of gluing up the stool. There's two sizes, both are exactly the same. Next one I'm going to move into is the kind of reading rocking stool. There's a couple things I ran into on this that in hindsight I probably would have cut out. The two top panels, so these are serving as basically the seating planks on top. Again, they were just rectangular pieces, and so I figured they'd be easy enough to cut on the table saw, which they were. However, getting my alignment for these holes to register with the legs proved to be a little difficult, and so I came up with a nice solution to kind of resolve that. So again, I'd probably end up cutting these out on the CNC machine next time. However, I did go ahead and just do these on the drill press. The two legs we did cut out last time. The couple things that are different about this is I added kind of an OG profile in the end that was more of a stylistic choice to reveal a little bit more of the Baltic birch lamination on the bottom. Again, just kind of a nice detail there, but it also kind of reduced the footprint on the floor as well, so you have a nice kind of rocking motion. If you look at the top here, you'll notice that there was a little bit of a blunder. Obviously, I went back and re-drilled a couple things, but to center these the way that I wanted to, I created a jig. Just using same material, 3/4 inch Baltic birch. You've got your top piece here, the two holes with the alignment, and then I went ahead and created some darker lines on here just so you'd be able to see it with a Sharpie marker. So I lined everything up. I've got my center mark here on the middle of the panel, and then what I did was I wrote front, of course, so you don't forget your alignment, so that's always pointed towards you, and then this just sits on top of your piece here, and then I'm using the center line as my registration for the jig, and then I would go ahead and just use a regular clamp to put on there to hold it in place, and then I put this in my vise, and I used my just handheld router with a pattern bit to get my alignment on those. And basically all you do is go ahead and drill your two holes, flip this over, again, registering on that center line, and then you go ahead and proceed to do that with the other one. Now the glue up for this, you don't necessarily have to do the two panels along with the two stretcher pieces on the bottom. This is a small enough piece and scale that you get enough rigidity with the two stretchers. However, I think for the sake of showing you guys, we'll go ahead and just show a dry run of gluing this up. So I've got these 1-inch walnut pegs that I'm using to register my top, but also serving a decorative purpose. All right. The next step is to add the two stretchers. They just go in the corresponding holes there. And then get these to register on the other side. Like I said, small enough piece. If you wanted to just add a couple clamps through the hole on either side to kind of suck everything together. If you're not quite getting the clamping pressure you like, of course, you want to check to make sure your dowels are the right length or that your mortises are deep enough. Sometimes even if they are, they don't quite pull, or there's enough glue in there that's preventing it from pulling it together. I always suggest too, if you want to get more even clamping pressure, to put some call blocks on either side. And again, that would just be a small strip of wood to kind of help distribute the clamping pressure. But like I said, you don't necessarily have to do it all at once. You can go ahead and do that, and then you can go ahead and add your pegs. I would go ahead and glue these in first, add a little bit of glue to your mortise. I've marked on either side which one is my nicer side. Should be good. So there you have the piece clamped up. I suppose if you felt like you needed to, you could find a way to clamp this to the bench top, but again, I think with enough surface area and the larger oversized tenons on top here, you've got plenty of glue. These things aren't going anywhere. You just want to make sure that they're drawed tightly to the two side pieces. So I want to kind of jump back to what I was talking about with the process of finishing. So a lot of times you think you'll build a project, you add the stain or dye or whichever sort of application you're using, and then spray your top coat. But depending on how you want things to look, or say you're building something where there's a lot of tight areas, you might consider doing some finishing before you glue things up. And that's kind of what happened with this chair here. We went ahead and cut out all of the pieces for this on the CNC machine, with the exception of the holes, or the attachment holes for the upholstered boards. Now this chair alone could do well without upholstery. However, I'm choosing to add a backrest and a seat pan that have an upholstery on them. And so what I did with these panels, I went ahead and just rolled some black latex paint on. I allowed that to dry. And then I went ahead and took an 1/8 inch chamfer bit, as you can kind of see on these edges here, to really crispen things up. Again, that was more of just an aesthetic choice. I wanted the lines to be really crisp. I also, along the way, which is something that happens quite often, is that you're making decisions in real time. And so on the originals, I did not do this. I allowed the tenons to be flush, but you'll notice out here, they're slightly proud, and then I went ahead and chamfered the exterior of the mortise itself too, again, just to really highlight that joint there. And so this is a great example of finishing before. This is something I would not have been able to do if I were to have just glued this up without paint on. And so I went ahead and did all the painting first, chamfered the edges, did as much sanding as I could on the edges, and then I went ahead and glued everything up at once, and basically just had clamps, 2 clamps for the seat pan, and then I had 2 clamps on the back side here to pull everything together. It was actually quite quick. I just used some traditional, again, Titebond yellow glue. However, if you're somebody that wants a little bit more open time, epoxy is always a good route to go, or even some hide glue. You just want to make sure that you're not getting paint in those mortises, otherwise you're not going to get the adherence that you'd like. So again, a great example of finishing technique prior to, or why I would make that decision. Like I said, I chose to go an upholstery route. I have not quite upholstered them yet, but I wanted these panels to be removable, because of course over time the upholstery will get a regular wear and tear. I just did some threaded inserts and then some compromat screws to attach the back panel and the seat pan, again just for easy removal. I'll probably just end up using some 1-inch high density foam and then just put the upholstery over the top of that. Got those, and then we did a project recently that was an outdoor bench, and I had some leftover material. I usually pick 2 or 3 different fabrics, and I had this leftover that's in an outdoor fabric that I just thought would look sharp with the black, but also contrast or complement well with the exposed edge of the Baltic birch. So now the last one we have is the taller version of the short stool we showed the assembly on. and the procedure was exactly the same. The only difference is on the face here, you'll notice there is some cherry double ply veneer here. But again, you can see the nice contrast of the Baltic birch along with the graining of the cherry. And then I went ahead and used some hard maple pegs as my wedges for those. Probably can't pick it up too much, but this is one that I drilled the holes ahead of time before the glue up and then went ahead and applied the legs. And again, they were just slightly off. I also ran into some issues with the veneer, which never fails, that I ended up sanding through it. So I think with a little stain and a little finishing, I can probably get those to mask a little bit. So not the end of the world, but again, just part of the learning process. I think that about wraps it up for me. I know we'll get these to a completely finished point, and maybe sometime in the near future we'll take a look at the final product. We'll probably talk about them a little bit in Facebook Live, but that's all I have for this time, and so stay tuned for some more plywood seating projects.